Okay, well, first of all, I'd like to thank each of you for being here this morning. Each of you in different ways has helped me to make it to this point, and I am extremely grateful for all that each of you has done in contributing to my success to this point. The first slide here simply shows an overview of my presentation and really the main areas to be addressed this morning. The title of my dissertation is a correlational study of transformational leadership and spiritual growth of congregants from multicultural churches of Christ in the United States. The purpose of this quantitative correlational study was to determine if a relationship exists between multicultural church leaders exemplifying transformational leadership behaviors and church members' spiritual growth. There were two main reasons for conducting this research. The first was that the church from the very beginning is always meant to be a collection of individuals from various ethnic, racial, and cultural backgrounds. And the second reason was because the United States is becoming more diverse with people from various backgrounds interacting with one another on a daily basis. There were three research questions that were developed in order to determine if any relationship exists between the independent and dependent variables. The first RQ asks if there's any relationship between transformational leadership behaviors and members' faith as it relates to their service of others. The second RQ asks if there's any relationship between transformational leadership behaviors and members' perceived closeness to God. And finally, the third RQ seeks to determine if transformational leadership behaviors are a significant predictor of members' spiritual growth. There were three null hypotheses that were also developed for this research in order to contribute and help to understand the research questions. These are basically negative statements related to the three RQs, stating that there is no statistically significant correlation between the independent and dependent variables. The research population was limited to members and leaders from churches of Christ that were identified as multicultural, and that is that they had a membership of having at least a 25% diversity of two or more group types, racial, ethnic, those kinds of things. Leaders were defined as those holding certain specific titles: shepherds, pastors, ministers, preachers, evangelists, or elders. But it did not include group leaders, church office staff, lay leaders, or worship song leaders. There were a total of 31 congregations which participated. And from those 31 congregations, there were 341 members. There were 35 leaders who took part in the research. I did have two leaders from two different congregations take the MLQ survey, but none of the members from either of those congregations participated, so they were unable to be utilized in this research. The research method used was a quantitative, correlational, non-experimental design. The data collection process and analysis were conducted using three tools: Qualtrics, Microsoft Excel, and social sciences statistics calculators. Participating congregants took a survey, which used a 7-point Likert scale and measures one's vertical perception of their closeness to God, one's horizontal perception of the degree to which one's faith leads them to serve others, as well as one's total faith maturity. The participating church leaders took a survey which used a 5-point Likert scale to measure transformational and transactional leadership behaviors. And finally, Pearson's R correlation was used to determine if a linear relationship exists between the variables. The analysis, here is a summary of the analysis of the findings, the results. The research found that all of the leaders surveyed were categorized as transformational in their behaviors. It also showed that the members who participated scored high in all three areas assessed by the faith maturity scale. But even though that was true, the research ultimately found that there is no statistically significant correlation between the independent and dependent variables. Thus, all three of the null hypotheses were accepted. If we look a little closer at the data, This chart here shows the individual leaders' scores. And we see that all of them scored above the baseline in the area of transformational leadership behaviors. The red line here indicates the baseline, which was 10.5. Any score above that line categorized a leader as transformational for these research purposes. This chart here simply shows the total MLQ scores per church. So the last one showed the individual leaders. This shows the leadership as the totals per church. In order to determine if a leader exemplified transformational behaviors, two other portions of the MLQ instrument were used, which assess transactional leadership behaviors. And this chart and the next one show that data. The blue line here indicates contingent reward, and the red line indicates management by exception active. And again, these are simply indications of how transactional one is in their behaviors. Here again, we see those total scores per church. If we look at the dependent variables a bit closer, we see that in this chart, the total FMS scores per church, and you can see that the scores are all above the red baseline. They're basically, and this is, I guess this is important for terminology, there's two ways two designations according to the FMS. There's low and there's high. Anything above that red line there indicates or is classified one as having a high faith maturity. Here we have the horizontal levels, and again the red line shows the point at which one would be classified as having a high horizontal faith. And finally, we have the members' vertical faith as assessed by the FMS, and again we see high scores across the board. Once the data was collected and sorted, Pearson's R was used to determine if a correlation exists between the variables. Now, the reason that Pearson's R was used is because it's not only the most widely used, but also because it looks for a linear relationship between two variables. And that is what this research was looking to see, if there was a linear relationship between the variables. The next few slides show the results of Pearson's R in relation to the three research questions, and I simply want to draw your attention for the moment to the yellow arrows, which show the Y and the X axis. The Y is the leaders, and the X is the members, and this is the same orientation on all the other slides. The next two slides, I just wanted to make sure that this was clear in the presentation. This slide here shows that there is no significant relationship between transformational leadership and one's horizontal faith. This slide shows that there's no significant relationship between transformational leadership and one's vertical faith. And finally, we see that there is no significant relationship between transformational leadership and one's overall faith. Because of the results of Pearson's R, all three of the null hypotheses were accepted. Now, although the study was unable to show a relationship between the variables, it did show that leaders and members from multicultural congregations scored high in the areas of transformational leadership behaviors and faith maturity. And these really are not necessarily surprising findings. It's been shown in the literature that leaders who are working in multicultural environments and who are successful share certain characteristics. And some of those are transformational behaviors, as well as having a high level of cultural intelligence. These leaders also have a positive effect on an organization's overall success. Nordhaus makes the point that the research has shown that transformational leadership may also affect group ethics, decision-making, and moral actions. The literature also shows that groups often impact and influence individuals' character and behaviors. So it makes sense that if you have members are being added to a local multicultural congregation, that they would begin to take on the group's behaviors. And if one of those characteristics, if some of those behaviors had to do with spiritual maturity, that group exemplified spiritual maturity, then that could foster growth in new members as well. So the findings seem to be in line with what other literature has shown. What might be some implications and applications for ministry? Well, three areas really come to mind. The first is the local church. The second is missionary boards or church planting committees. And the third is religious educational institutions. For the local church, it would be advisable that leaders take self-assessment surveys on a somewhat regular basis, maybe a yearly or even every other year, especially for those churches that are multicultural or beginning to see their demographics shift towards being multicultural. Leadership behaviors are learned, so leaders can continue to grow in this area. And again, there's been many benefits that have been found in according to the literature. For mission boards and church planning committees, they could utilize transformational leadership surveys as part of their recruitment applications, as well as implement training programs in transformational leadership behaviors. And this is important because, and this would be important for local church leaders as well, but this is important because the literature has shown that those who have high levels of transformational behaviors are less likely to experience burnout when they're in a multicultural environment. Finally, the religious educational institutions like Bible colleges and seminaries could introduce classes or even whole programs which focused on transformational leadership from a biblical and theological perspective. The reality is that the United States is likely to become more diverse in the coming years and not less, so equipping leaders for the work of ministry within multicultural environments is vital. The research was a non-experimental, quantitative correlational design. The independent variable was transformational leadership as assessed by the MLQ, and dependent variables were horizontal faith, vertical faith, and total faith as assessed by the FMS. Now, these instruments are both well-attested, highly regarded, but there are limitations to these self-assessment surveys. It's been noted in the literature that people's self-perception can often differ from reality. Pearson-Czar was used to determine if a linear relationship exists between the variables, and while, again, highly regarded, very useful, there are also limitations to Pearson-Czar as well. It's not designed to tell the difference between the variables. It doesn't show the slope of the line, only relationship, if relationship exists. And of course, it can be misinterpreted, misunderstood. Finally, Qualtrics, Excel, and social sciences calculators were used in the data collection and analysis. And while these tools are useful, they're easy to use, they also have limitations. They're limited in their abilities. Other tools such as SPSS, Excel Stat, and JMP statistical software are much more robust in their features. When thinking about further research, 4 recommendations are presented here. First, a study which replicates this one would be helpful in confirming or negating the results of this study. Because this research was done during a time when there were multiple external issues affecting the majority of the United States citizens, replicating this research in 3 or 4 years when these external factors are lessened or eliminated might yield different results. The reality is that all of the leaders who gave reasons for not participating, not all of them gave a reason, but every leader that gave a reason for not participating in this study gave either the global pandemic or racial tensions or both as why they were unwilling to participate. The second recommendation would be to utilize different instruments and or a combination of instruments. So for example, using the leadership practices inventory instrument in conjunction with the faith maturity scale or some other combination of different instruments would be useful research for the future. The next recommendation would be to conduct a qualitative case study to do in-depth research on either one church or a small number of churches and see what that data shows. And finally, research could be conducted which remove the limitations of a congregation being multicultural and survey all churches of Christ in the United States and then separate those into maybe congregations which are multicultural, those which are not identified as multicultural, in an attempt to see if there's any differences between leadership behaviors, possibly leadership behaviors and spiritual growth. And that would be interesting research for the future as well. Now, when I think about lessons that I've learned, there are a few that come to mind right away. The first is that effective, reliable research is hard work and time consuming. And now that might seem obvious. And if I would have been asked prior to entering this program if research of this type, this caliber, was easy, I certainly would have said no. Of course it's not. I would have had a mental understanding of it, but I have gained an experiential appreciation for just how hard and time-consuming it really is. Knowing something intellectually and knowing something experientially are two different things, at least in my mind, as it's related to this research and how to go about it. The second thing that I've learned is that there are times when one has to pivot, one has to change directions, they have to be somewhat flexible. There were a few times in this dissertation journey that I had to make changes and even go in different directions. And there's one time that always comes to mind, and it had to do with rewriting a major portion of my prospectus. And it was a difficult and it was a fairly dark couple of days because it was really one of the only times where I felt that I might not be able to finish. But with lots of prayer, encouragement from my wife, and of course, direction and guidance from my advisor, I was able to adjust and move forward. So that's something that I learned, that flexibility, adjusting and changing directions is sometimes needed, and a person needs to be able to do that. I also found that accessing the research population and recruiting participants is difficult. I was fairly naive, thinking that it would be easy, that anybody that I sent a letter to asking if they would participate, that they would jump on board and fill out a 5 to 10 minute survey. I was seriously wrong about that. There's some difficulties, there's some challenges that have to be overcome. In fact, this may very well be one of the more difficult things to overcome, one of the greater challenges, because if you don't have participants, you can't do the research. At least you can't conduct the research that I was attempting to conduct. I've learned that sometimes you end up with more questions than answers. Going into this research, I had certain assumptions, I had certain expectations that the data simply did not bear out. And because of that, I have more questions. I assumed that there would be a relationship between transformational leadership and spiritual growth of members. The data showed that those assumptions were wrong. But now the question is why? Why does the data show what it shows? So in some ways, I think that this research is more interesting because it's gone against those assumptions, raises all kinds of new questions. If assumptions would have been confirmed, it's not that the research would have been unimportant or unuseful. It would have been important and useful. It wouldn't have raised as many questions, I don't think. So I think it's far more interesting in my mind. And finally, I've gained a deep appreciation for this E.D.D. program as a whole. I put on the slide that this program is a guide, like Virgil was to Dante in the Divine Comedy. And what I mean by that is Dante in the comedy, he has to go through hell and he has to climb Mount Purgatory and all of that. But he needed a guide. He needed Virgil to get him there. Virgil was his guide. He needed someone to show him the way, to encourage him, to lead him to his destination. And that was this program as a whole for me. I have a number of colleagues, I have a number of friends who are either currently in doctorate programs or recently come out of those programs. And they have all kinds of of challenges that I have not had to face because they were simply left to do it on their own. In fact, I'm thinking of one man who did not graduate. His time ran out. Now, I don't know if he would have completed the journey had he been in this program. I just know that having a guide step you through the process is extremely invaluable. So I have learned and gained a deep appreciation for this program. Well, that is the end of my my presentation. I believe it's time for discussion.